All right, somebody remind us, what is the Cold War? It sounds like some advertising campaign by Under Armour. You know,
The conflict between the free world and
free world and communism. All right, what are the three phases of this war? Okay. Did you notice the accent there? He's saying it a little bit better, I think. Go ahead. Détente. Say it again. See that? That word. And I'm sorry, the last one. Reagan gets elected and wants to win. You know, again, at that point too, there's a bunch of crazy people in the world who thought it was perfectly fine to slaughter hundreds of thousands of people so that they could be in charge. All right, and Reagan said, "This is crazy. Let's kill them. We win, they lose." All right, today I want to look at those three phases. Yesterday we defined it, talked about some of the general activities that kind of go through the whole time frame. Today I want to look through the events in these different phases of the war. All right, first one is the Truman Doctrine. And at least from what we're going to talk about, there's a lot of material here, so don't start to panic if this takes longer. The other two sections are combined less than this one because there's a lot taking place there. Truman Doctrine. If you want some years for this, it's 47 to 69. It was in 1947 that Truman makes this statement. It was part of a speech. It was actually part of his response to the first event here, a civil war in Greece, outlining the basic American policy. So the Truman Doctrine, if we need it again, said that we would only try to contain communism wherever it was. We were going to try to prevent it from spreading. His speech talks about how we're going to go any place where there's the communists are trying to take over, and we're going to help the insurgents and try to fight them off. He does not talk about playing offense. It's just contain them where they are. Which in the sporting realm is crazy. In a realm of these people want to take over the world, we're only playing defense. All right, so it doesn't make any sense. All right, let's look at some of the events that take place in this section of the war. The first one is in actually 1947, a civil war in Greece. The communists had infiltrated and were trying to overthrow the existing government. And we step in and help. I mean, we're not physically present there much, but we give support and aid to the government side, the side against communism. And in this case, the anti-communist forces are successful. Greece does not become communist. All right, the next thing to talk about, we have Greece. The next is the Berlin airlift. The Berlin airlift. Does anybody know what happened to Germany following World War II? You know, things more than they built buildings back that had gotten flattened. Thomas?
Sir, the city was divided, or the city of Berlin was divided into half.
Okay. All right. Okay. We have the city of Berlin that is occupied by the Allied forces, and the Soviets occupy one half, and the other countries occupy the other. So the city itself gets split as we get into the Cold War. One side is occupied and controlled by the communists. The other side is occupied by the free people. And then to the complicating factor here is that Germany itself gets split in two pieces. The Soviets occupy East Germany, and the other countries occupy West Germany. And as this Cold War gets going here, we see Germany split into two pieces, East and West Germany, East Germany being communist. So we have this section being communist from there over basically, and Berlin in the middle of the communist section with this pocket of freedom. All right. And what the short story is, and what the Soviets are trying to do, is they were trying to starve those people out and force them to accept communism. All right. What they, let me give you some dates here. June the 24th of 48, Germany here, but these things are being directed and orchestrated out of the Soviet Union. Germany announced that they would not let any land or water transportation into West Berlin, the free side of Berlin, the western side. No land, no water transportation. And they're they were going to allow air traffic. That's where we get the Berlin airlift, but nothing by land or water. That they could, they controlled all the land around. They could stop that really easily. And to appreciate what's going on here, if you can imagine partitioning off a chunk of Chicago with about 2 million people in it, and don't allow anything on land or water into that. Food, heating, things to heat their houses, medical supplies, nothing by land or water. So they were trying to starve these people out and force them to accept communism this way. So that was June the 24th. That was announced on June the 26th, 2 days later. The Allies began organizing this Berlin airlift of flying everything these 2 million people would need in. And this goes on until May the 12th of the next year. All right, so what was the date? June the 26th through May the 12th. Everything they can possibly need. Not everything they could need, not everything they could possibly want, everything they needed. And we went through the winter time, so things to heat their houses, coats, shoes, clothes, food, medical supplies. A massive undertaking. It's hard to really appreciate it. On average, it was 25 flights an hour into Berlin. The schedule for the landing and unloading was tight enough that if a pilot missed his landing, if something didn't go right, and he had to circle and come back in again, there wasn't an opening. He'd circle and go back and come back another day. So it was very, very tight. They had all kinds of I don't know. And they made the best. They did the best they could with it. They have contests, seeing how quickly they could unload these cargo planes. That was the bottleneck, flying this stuff in. I forget the record, but it was if I remember right, single digits of minutes. Plane lands and everything's off. But anyway, it was not an obvious thing that this was going to be successful. The Soviets didn't think we could pull it off. They thought there's no way we can get enough stuff in here, and it's just a matter of time that they'll buckle under out of hunger and accept communism. So we pull it off. May the 12th of the following year is when Russia lifted this blockade. That Germany, through the Soviet handlers, lift this blockade. Okay, so the Berlin airlift, 1848 into 49. All right, the next thing to talk about is China. In China. All right, what's going on in China at this point? We've referenced it, at least in passing, when we went through the war. Stephanie knows? Joseph?
There's two groups in China, one was communists and one was nationals. Chiang Kai-shek was in charge of the nationals. He wanted to free China, but Mao Zedong wanted to counter China, and throughout World War II, they had to fight together. And China
Okay.
once and then they fought each other.
They sort of fought together, but yeah. Prior to World War II, there was an ongoing civil war. There was a communist faction versus a free faction. Chiang Kai-shek for the free, Mao Zedong for the communist side. And when Japan attacked them, they had a larger enemy, a common enemy. So they did turn and face Japan. Once World War II is over, then they go back to fighting. The communists still want to take over. In 1947, we stopped supporting the free side. Again, I really can't give you a good reason for this. The textbook says that it was justified because it would have required a massive military buildup that America wasn't ready for. There were allegations of corruption and fraud in the nationalist forces. I really don't have a good answer. We abandon, if you just take Truman's policy at face value, we're going to help anybody that's doing this, and we walk out of China, we abandon them. So that was 47. We withdrew our support from them, and it was 1949 that the communists take over China. 1949. What happened to Chiang Kai-shek and those who were able to get out that didn't like communism? Stephanie will share, and if you look at her, she looks very greedy, but she will share. She's got that face you can tell. No? Maybe you could text her the answer. Stephanie?
They moved to Taiwan.
Yes, they moved to Taiwan off the coast of China and formed the country of Taiwan there. That's where the free people went. Back in ancient history, when Clinton was president, when you guys were in diapers, and other times, but China started having exercises with their navy and things around Taiwan. It was very threatening moves, like they wanted to take over. And Bill Clinton actually started talking like, well, yeah, there's Chinese people there. We should, they should probably all be united back in the same country. All right, I remember just a massive uproar and him backing off of that. But he was willing to just throw the people who had fled their own country in order to not live under communism. Just, oh yeah, maybe we should let them take it. Extremely infuriating. But anyway, that's where the free people left there. They went to Taiwan and formed that. Okay, so we have that going on in China in 49. Next thing is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Can anybody guess what part of the world the North Atlantic Treaty Organization dealt with? We got Morgan to smile.
We're in Belgium, right?
Oh, their headquarters? I think so. But what countries are involved? I'm sorry, it was kind of a tongue-in-the-cheek question. Yeah, the countries around the North Atlantic. That was us, the countries in Western Europe, those countries lining themselves together to defend themselves against communism. This thing is formed in 49. I'm not going to list the countries, but if you think of the North Atlantic, all the countries around that, those are the ones involved. So that was the free countries making a pact together to defend themselves against communism, to respond as a group. The Soviets, or the communist countries, they formed their own association. This would be like the North Atlantic Rapist Association forming to defend themselves against innocent women or something. I mean, these are the evil people in the world. But they made their own league to defend themselves against us. Does anybody know the name of that one? Well, no, that is the Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republics. Good try. Nobody knows. Where did you go to high school? Oh, come on. What's wrong with your history teachers? All right, the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet or the communist response to this thing. It really, I mean, these are the people that, it's fine to kill anybody. It's okay if 3/4 of the world dies as long as the rest are communist. Them making a pact to defend themselves against the free countries. It is odd, to say the least. Okay, so NATO is formed in 49. The next thing is Korea. This peninsula, peninsula here. Following World War II, Korea gets occupied by America and the Soviet Union. Once Germany is defeated, FDR talks the Soviets into joining the war against Japan, and they do come along just in time to occupy major portions of northern China and North Korea. They never actually do any fighting, but they take all kinds of territory. So anyway, the northern half gets occupied by the Soviets, the southern half by the free countries. And we have a split there just like we did in Germany. We end up with North Korea being communist, South Korea being free. Thinking there was something else I was going to mention, but oh well. That so the original plan, like it was other places, was for there to be an election and all of Korea to form one government, and both the Soviets and us would back out and set them free. The Soviets never go along with plans like that. So it ends up being two separate countries. That was in 1945. They had that joint occupation. By 1950, America pulls out. They have elections, they have their own government. We're setting them free. So that was earlier in 1950. And then in June the 25th of 50, North Korea attacks South Korea. Okay, and the Korean War is on. June the 25th. We were just in Japan, so it's not like we were all the way across in California or something. We were just in Japan, so it was not months and months for us to respond. MacArthur is still there. He comes over and they're able to stop this initial attack and eventually push it back. You might have heard of the Pusan perimeter. That was the corner of Korea that the free forces get pushed to, where they stop the advance. And then there's the Incheon landings, where MacArthur lands forces behind the North Korean lines. Anyway, so there's some significant maneuvering going on here, but basically MacArthur brings the American troops back over, they stop the advance, and then they push the North Koreans back. And by December of 1950, they pushed them back up to around the northern border of North Korea, so up towards the border of China. So in that 6-month span or so, the North Korea attacks and drives into the south. We stop the assault, counterattack, and push deep into North Korea. And that's by December of 1950. And at that point, about 300,000 Chinese troops join the North Koreans. And now we have the Chinese and the North Koreans attacking us. The Chinese are communists. At this point, still working closely with the Soviets. So at that point, we have the outside forces coming in here to help the North Koreans, and the battle lines get pushed back south to essentially the original boundary. They get pushed back to that point, right? It's the 38th parallel, right to that point. That takes place by April of 1951. So we're not talking about a super long time, but through that winter time, the lines get pushed back down to that. I'm sorry, I gave the wrong line, wrong date. That was January of 1950. It was April when MacArthur gets removed from his position by January. Okay, so we have some relatively quick movements, and then by early 1951, everything back around the 38th parallel. Now, the date April 11th that I gave you, that's the date MacArthur was fired. Truman removes him from his position. And our textbook here, there's, they take a very hard line against MacArthur. Let me read you what our textbook said. I disagree with this a little bit. MacArthur's rank insubordination, as Truman called it, was not only undesirable, but dangerous, unconstitutional, and counter to the American tradition of keeping the military under the control of civilians. MacArthur had given some interviews to some magazines and things like that, and spoke very harshly about Truman and some of the things that some of the rules of engagement that he was forced to live with. Another quote a little bit later: "Not since Washington had a general come close to wielding as much power with public opinion as had MacArthur. It was a battle Truman had to engage in." The book is making the point that MacArthur was so famous and so well liked in America that he could have ridden this thing and toppled the whole system. Much like Washington, I kind of grimace like Stephanie. Much like Washington, really, at the end of the war, he could have established himself as dictator or whatever he wanted to, because he was so popular. So anyway, the book points out the fact that he was insubordinate. But let me give you a little bit of what was happening, and I think it changes the picture a whole lot. MacArthur was given some really crazy rules that he had to follow. They come out of Truman's policy of containment. Remember, he's not wanting to turn North Korea free, or even possibly take China and cause it to be free again. He's wanting to contain this thing. So MacArthur had some very severe restrictions. He was not allowed to do any type of activity that would in any way affect China. There was the river here as the border for a significant chunk. It even got to the point where he was only allowed, and this, if you think of the precocity of this, he was only allowed to bomb the half of the river that was on the North Korean side. He couldn't bomb the half of the river that was on the Chinese side. maybe with a smart bomb we could do that. But so he was not allowed to extend this war into China, which there were 300,000 roughly Chinese troops attacking our men. And he's told, no, we can't affect them. There were air bases in China, and they would fly planes into North Korea and attack us. And as soon as they got across the border, he had to stop pursuing them. He couldn't go bomb the air bases. All right, so MacArthur was given some extremely frustrating things, and he was watching men get killed because of this. And that's what pushes him to start to speak out and say this is crazy. So he probably rank insubordination might be a fairly good description, but to me the rules that he was forced to work under were very bad, and in a lot of ways justified him beginning to resist this thing. So anyway, if you read about MacArthur and Eddie's all bad, that's I'm not saying he might not have stepped on a line some, but the rules were crazy. All right, this idea of containment applied here was crazy. It would have been one thing if China hadn't got involved. I mean, they were actually involved. It'd be like Pastor Armacost saying, "You guys can't fight in the dorm," and I don't know. Lawrence walks up to Matthew and just starts pummeling him in the face. And Pastor Armacost is there and says, "You can't punch him back. There's no fighting." And Lawrence just continues to pound you, and you just have to stand there. Wait a second, he's punching me. This doesn't make any sense. And that really is the position that MacArthur was put in here. Truman was saying, you can't respond. And he's saying, they already attacked us. I mean, how do we not respond? So, would you do that? No. Come on. All right, Korea. Questions there? All right, let's go to Cuba. Woohoo! Our president is there right now. I heard it described yesterday that, I might have mentioned this, that while Brussels is being bombed, our president is on a tandem bicycle ride with the Cuban dictator. was an interesting picture. I could see him. He'd be the guy in front. It's always the feminine person in the front because they don't really have to pedal. And that's where he would be. So. Play a baseball?
They played a baseball game. Because there used to be, I don't know, there was a big...
The president?
No,
oh.
We went to the baseball game.
Okay.
We played the first baseball game since whatever.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
So
they're a communist country.
Major League Baseball start again.
Okay, I don't know. They're a communist country. Oh well. Cuba. Let's talk about it. All right. First thing here, 1959 is when Cuba becomes the socialist paradise that it is today. Fidel Castro establishes a dictatorship there.
Do you think he's still alive?
Oh, I don't know. The president's been meeting with Raul Castro, his brother.
And I saw a news report that said Fidel Castro was nowhere to be seen.
Yeah. I don't think they've never said he was dead. The last few times he was in public, he looked really bad. He'd be really old. So who knows? I don't know. My guess is he's dead, but who knows? All right, so 1959, we have a communist dictatorship established in Cuba, right off the coast of Florida. So this isn't Korea or someplace like that. It's not China. This is right off the coast of Florida. So very understandably a significant situation. So prior to that, we had all kinds of economic ties. We talked about that briefly before, coming out of the Spanish-American War. We had, people would go there for vacation. Wow, it's hard to think of. Anyway, that all changed in '59, become a communist country. All right, a couple of things happened here in the aftermath of this. The next one is the Bay of Pigs, still with Cuba. The Bay of Pigs incident. This takes place 2 years or so later, April the 17th, 1961. Here, President Kennedy inherited a program that was started by Eisenhower where we were going to train some Cubans and help land and insert them in Cuba so they can try to overturn this, at that point, newly created communist dictatorship. So it was something that was started prior to him. He inherited it. he allowed the attack to go on, but very, very half-heartedly. Landed the men, refused to supply air cover for them. Just a very half-hearted attempt. And this thing is completely obliterated. All the guys are captured or killed. It never really was even a contest. There wasn't any pitched battle. It was very, very ugly. We landed about 1,600 Cubans that we had trained at the Bay of Pigs, and it's a completely blown away. No real contest. Major embarrassment, if nothing else. For those guys, it was much more than an embarrassment. That was Kennedy. Kennedy is made to look extremely weak. I don't think it was a look. I think it was reality. But he was exposed. He was extremely weak on communists because, you could say, well, it was started by another president, whatever. But I mean, he's the one that authorized it. He's the one that sent it. And he sends this half-hearted thing, and it blows up in his face, literally. All right, so that was April of 1962. Go ahead a little bit, we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is still under Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. September of 1962. All right. Kennedy's newly in office in 61, blunders with this Bay of Pigs is made to look very bad. That was April. This isn't in our Cuba section, but I'll mention afterwards. It was July of 61 that the Berlin Wall gets built. So April, we have the Bay of Pigs disaster. Midsummer, the Berlin Wall goes up, and Kennedy does nothing about it, just, lets them build the wall, splitting East Germany in half with a physical wall at that point. The people in East Germany had been escaping to the free side. About 1,000 a day were getting out of the communist countries to go to the free countries. And so they build this wall to stop it, this defensive mechanism, more than just a wall, very massive structure. But Kennedy does nothing there. All right, so he's looking very weak. Run into 62, which is an election year. Wasn't a presidential election, but a midterm election. And he's looked extremely weak. All right, now this is a little bit of speculation here, but I think this plays into his response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which takes place in the fall of 62. October the 22nd through the 28th are the crunch days of this thing. When are elections? November, the first Monday after the first Tuesday in November. So this is literally 2 weeks or a week and a half before the election when this thing falls apart. Maybe two and a half when he starts it. And the Democrats have this reputation of being weak. There's these two major examples within the last year and a half of them responding very, very softly to the Soviets. All right, let's talk about what happens. The Soviets began giving support to Cuba and began helping them build nuclear missile bases in Cuba. They weren't actually built yet, but they're in the process of being built, these bases. Kennedy finds out about it. Maybe as one of the luncheons that him and Khrushchev had together. I'm kidding. We had satellite photos and intelligence. We began to put the pieces together to realize what they're doing. All right. So Kennedy goes to confront them. And to me, the way he confronted them is extremely curious. Here we have the two major world powers. One of them is building some nuclear missiles right off the coast of the other country. And Kennedy's response is to go on national television and announce to the country what the Soviets are doing. All right, it instantly escalated the tension. And again, I think it's easy to think about, sorry girls, the guys' dorm. I was never in the girls' dorm. Imagine sometime at devotions. You still have devotions in the evenings? Yeah. You're sitting at devotions and Jacob is there for some reason. And he's got a problem with Thomas. You guys even, all right, you're both there. So instead of Jacob just approaching Thomas and saying, hey, why did you key my car or something, why did you do this? Jacob stands up in devotions and says, everybody, I just want you to know that Thomas is this lousy dog and he keyed my car, and if anything ever happens, Right? Think of the tension instantly. Right? And that's what Kennedy did. He could have sent messages through the diplomatic channels and other places, and it would have got to the Soviets and just said, hey, we're not real happy with these nuclear missiles. It'd be unfortunate if we had one of our bombers where we didn't get the bombs attached very closely and we had this accident over top of Korea. It'd be very sad. He could have sent some messages like that and given the Soviets a chance to deal with this out of the public eye. But that was the announcement. It was not like he was communicating with Khrushchev and Khrushchev was refusing to work with him. That was the announcement. October the 26th, they're building nuclear missile bases there. He warns the world at that point that if there's ever an attack from Cuba, we're going to respond by attacking the Soviet Union. He says, we know the attack's not coming from Cuba, it's the Soviet Union. And it instantly escalates this thing. Again, we can't prove it. Kennedy's got shot in the head, so we can't analyze his brain to see what he was thinking. But to me, it explains a little bit if you think about this is an election. And he has a reputation for being weak with the Soviets. And now right beforehand, he can pull off this thing and look like, I hear every now and then that Kennedy stared Khrushchev in the eye and Khrushchev blinked and, all this bravado. It gives him that for the election. So either way, October the 22nd, he goes on national radio, national television, addresses the nations what's going on, warns the Soviet that we're going to respond to them if anything comes out of Cuba. So it escalates this thing. And it was October the 28th when Khrushchev announces that he would remove the missiles. So here officially, Khrushchev backs down. Unofficially, there was some deal making going on. There were two things that we agreed to in the we always hear about the smoke-filled rooms where the deals are made. Two things we agreed to. One, we agreed to remove some missiles from Turkey that the Soviets didn't like, and we also agreed never to attempt to remove Castro. That had happened. Bay of Pigs. There were other ongoing things to remove Castro. We agreed to quit trying to remove Castro. So part of this deal was they give up missiles that weren't even installed. We agreed to permanently live with this communist state right off of our border, and we move missiles out of Turkey. If you look at the whole package, not quite such the good deal. Okay, Cuban Missile Crisis. Now again, I should probably back up. Those days between the 22nd and 28th, it was a real crisis. It was, tensions were high. Again, if you imagine the rec room there when the accusations are flowing, and girls, maybe you don't have pride like us guys, but nobody wants to be accused like that in front of all the other guys and told what you're not going to ever do again, right? That would, I'll tell you, I'll show you what I'm not going to ever, that's in your mind, we'll do something. And that was in everybody's mind, all right? It doesn't happen, obviously. In the 28th, there's this gigantic sigh of relief by everybody. Khrushchev doesn't say, well, if you're going to attack us, I might as well launch mine first. That doesn't come, and that was the fear. All right, so a real legitimate crisis. I think here Kennedy handled it in a way that made it much more provocative than it had to be. And my guess is there's the election in his mind. So, okay, Cuba, questions there?
The policy of mutually assured destruction,
MAD, which is a good acronym.
That's sort of what that is.
Yeah, I don't know when that officially came about. I know by Reagan, he talked about how it was MAD. I don't know that. It's a good question. All right, let's keep going on here. We got a couple more things with this first phase of the war. The next one I already mentioned, but if you didn't write it down, didn't fit with Cuba. July of '62, we have the Berlin Wall being built, and Kennedy not responding. Violation of some treaties and other things, and just the fact that it was built to keep people under communism. And he just lets it go. All right, then the last thing we need to talk about is Vietnam. The front half of Vietnam. All right, Vietnam, following the war, was occupied by France. Does that tell us enough that it's going to go bad? Occupied by France. They give up this control in 1954. There had been going, before 1954 even, there were communist agitators in there, Ho Chi Minh and his followers there getting financing and support from China and the Soviet Union. There was this ongoing attempts to overthrow the government prior to 1954. 1954, France gives up and walks out, and then we get Vietnam getting split, like we've seen other places. The north half is occupied by the communists, the south half is free. We get North and South Vietnam. So that was 54 that we get all of that happening. Almost immediately, the communist forces continue to try to infiltrate the South, continue to try to overturn the South Vietnamese government. And we begin giving them assistance. Our assistance actually even goes back under when France was there, but we begin giving them assistance, money, equipment. Eventually, by about 1960, we start sending men over to help train. In 1960, we had about 800 men there. And through the next 4 or 5 years, we see the numbers of our troops there, mostly serving as trainers or advisors, not so much the frontline shock troops attacking, but there as help. By 1964, it gets up to 23,000, so we are talking about some significant involvement at that point. All right, still, okay, 1964, some things change. In 1964, on July the 30th, we had one of our ships attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, Tonkin. Gulf of Tonkin. It was one of our, not a battleship, it was a military ship attacked. July the 30th, Congress passes something called the Tonkin Resolution on August the 7th, which was not a full declaration of war, but it did allow for full American involvement. So it allowed, at this point, Johnson to commit full, large-scale military numbers to this fray. So the Tonkin Resolution, that was the thing that the Congress allowing this.
Could you spell that again?
Tonkin, Tonkin Resolution. All right, so that was 64. By 67, we have about 500,000 troops in Vietnam, operating under some crazy rules. If there's a full declaration war, the president gets a lot of sway, and Congress is pushed out of it. This is not a declaration, so we had Congress meddling and some really, really stupid rules they were fighting under. Probably think of Vietnam as an ugly, nasty war, and it really was, but I'm not sure what war you would ever describe as not being ugly and nasty. Right? Just this one, we get a whole lot more media coverage, we have a whole lot more footage. We have guys who are fighting in Vietnam in a very quick time frame, leaving the battlefield and coming back to the States, and not mentally being acclimated to not being in a war zone. And we talk, so there are some extra things that make this have that really ugly feel to it. Part of it is the way that the communists fought. They fought very nasty. They would load kids up with explosives or women up with explosives, and have them walk into camps. Kids that had been friendly with our troops before, now they would show up and they would blow themselves up, and it put our troops in a very bad spot. And if there's some woman walking down the road to a checkpoint or something, and our troops are saying stop, 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 and she doesn't, then they're forced to shoot her or just hope she doesn't have a bomb. And so there's some very ugly things that happen. There's war. Some of the ugliness, though, was caused by the other side. Now, our media wouldn't bother telling what the other side was doing. They just take the one incident where soldiers guessed wrong and they shot somebody who really wasn't strapped up with a bomb, and talk about atrocities that our troops are committing. Even John Kerry reminiscent of Genghis Khan or something like that is the way he said it in his when he testified before Congress. All right, so some very, very ugly fighting. But that was by 1967, 500,000 troops or more American troops committed there. All right, that is the end of the Truman Doctrine. Let's go to détente, the next phase. This is 69 to 80. All right, this was Nixon is the first president here, and it goes to the end of Carter. So Nixon, Ford, and Carter here if you want the presidents. Kayla told me détente is literally calm down with the accent in it. Calm down. I have here lessening of tensions. That really is the thought. Let's just calm everybody down. We'll be nice and they'll be nice. The problem was only one side here is wanting to calm down. Be like Pastor Armacost as you guys are pummeling each other, turning to you and saying, "No, please just calm down. He'll quit punching you if you calm down." It's the fact that you look angry that causes him to continue to punch you. All right, that really is what's going on here. We're going to calm down. It doesn't work very well. Okay, so that's a general description. A couple more things here, just general things. In this wave of détente here, we get a whole bunch of things like this. We have a bunch of trade negotiations where we go to the Soviets and we make trade deals with them, trying to lessen tensions. They were literally at times unable to feed themselves. And our government would sell them American grain below the market price so that they could feed themselves. Again, here these people want to kill us and they're starving to death and we feed them, all right, rather than let that drive them over the edge. So there's a whole wave of that type of thing. And there's a whole wave of increased negotiations over military type things, missile treaties, things of that nature. Let me give you just a couple of names that come up here. There was a SALT I and a SALT II agreements. Those are strategic arm limitations talks. There was an anti-ballistic missile treaty. So there's a whole wave of those things. Now, you can look in the other phases and you'll see negotiations and things like that, but there's a renewed emphasis on that of let's lessen tension, let's get rid of our missiles so we can't blow each other up, that type of thing. So we see renewed or maybe more of that type of activity. So, okay, beyond those generalities, we need to talk about two things here. We need to talk about Vietnam, and then we talk about Nixon visiting China. All right, lessening of tensions. We have, by the time Nixon comes in and has wanting to orchestrate détente, Vietnam has become a big mess. So what he starts to do is pull American troops out. Again, we're wanting to lessen tensions. It's hard to not be mad at each other when you have your own troops in the field shooting. So he's trying to pull our troops out. The official word here that's used is the Vietnamization of the war. We were trying to turn it over to let the South Vietnamese fight for themselves, the Vietnamization. But he's pulling our troops out so that at least there was a couple of steps between the actual fighting and us and the Soviets. So we could, when we negotiate with the Soviets, we don't actually both have troops in the field shooting each other. That was the thinking. So anyway, he starts that by the summer of '69 as he takes office and begins to run things. By 1973, there's a ceasefire in Vietnam. And we completely pull our troops out. The communists do what they always do. They negotiate, agree to the ceasefire, say, yes, you guys should all leave. They wait till we leave, and then they begin attacking again. All right, so the attacks continue. And it was 1975 when South Vietnam falls to communism. South Vietnam and the whole area. All of French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, that whole area falls to communism, 1975. Okay, oh well, better leave it there. Okay, so Vietnam. The other thing to mention here is January of '72 when Nixon visits China. Sometimes he gets really hammered for this. I don't know, I kind of go back and forth. I mean, China is obviously a communist country. The official reason, or the justification for this, which I can kind of see, is that China and the Soviets were beginning to have friction between themselves. They're both communist nations, but they were beginning to both fight for control and direction and disagreeing about policies and things like that. So this was seen as an attempt to drive that wedge between the two of them. You know, if the president is visiting China, the Soviets aren't going to like that. So that was the excuse. Anyway, he's there in January of '72. Nixon, there's pictures of him on the Great Wall of China and other things. So he does eventually go to the Soviet Union as well, but this was an attempt to drive that wedge in. So Nixon in China. Questions about détente? Lessening of tensions. All right, let's get to Reagan. We've got 10 minutes. We're going to do this. Reagan is the shortest part here. We're going to watch an entire documentary about this later. All right, Reagan, his idea, and these are his words, we win, they lose. That was his response. You know, going back to the Matthew and Lawrence fight, Matthew at some point says, I have a way to end this fight. I pummel Lawrence into the ground. And then the fight is over. And that was Reagan's response. We tried all kinds of other things, being nice, etc. And Reagan finally said, this is crazy. They want to kill us. We need to defeat them. End of the line. So, all right, so he wanted to actually win the Cold War. Now, there are people, liberal commentators and liberal politicians, that talked about nuclear war and how he's going to blow the world up, and he's this crazy cowboy on a ranch, and we've turned the insane asylum over to the inmates. You know, it's just this crazy rhetoric happening here. Much like if you pay attention, you know, I'm not a big Trump fan, but he's talking about, hey, let's build a wall. We got to have borders, and people say, oh, and they're blowing up about it. All right, he's right. We need to build a wall. We need to have borders. Anyway, Reagan here is completely right. We've got to win this thing. So let me summarize for you his approach. How there's three main facets, or three main things he does here to drive the Soviet Union over the edge. We don't actually, if you're wondering, we don't actually invade the Soviet Union and occupy the whole place. They collapse from within. Because of the pressure Reagan put on him. Right? So here's how he put pressure on them. One way is economic pressure. Any way he could, from financial transactions and freezing assets that they had in other countries, to something that kind of looks bad, but he negotiated with all of the oil-producing countries, OPEC in the Middle East, to increase production. You know, this is the crazy Muslims. He gets them to increase their production, so it drove the price of oil and natural gas and other things down, right? Which for us is a gigantic boom. You know, think of the difference to you when you're paying $1.80 for a gallon of gas as opposed to $3.50. I mean, that's a tremendous advantage. So America's under this great boom of cheap fuel. The Soviet Union, who their government made tons of money selling natural gas. Now all of a sudden the natural gas, they're hardly making any money on it. Okay, so things like that. Anywhere he could, he went after them. The film we'll watch addresses the natural gas a little bit, but he was trying to bankrupt them. You know, trying to cut off sources of income. All right, so economic pressure, that was one. Second thing he did was very aggressive resistance to Soviet advances. Anywhere around the world that they were making advances, Reagan intensified the approach. Grenada, when we sent troops in there, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, the Contras, much, much more aggressive. Anybody ever hear some conspiracy nut saying, yeah, America created Osama bin Laden, or something like that? There's actually a little truth to that. It was people like him in Afghanistan that we were giving weapons to because they were fighting the Soviets. The Mujahideen, and there's several groups of Muslims there, that we were giving them weapons. We were giving them money so they could fight the communists. So they are completely twisting all the facts, but there's that grain of truth.
Did we send the CIA over to
Yes, to train them. I mean, they were fighting the Soviets, so we're going to do all we can. And the Soviets are there for 10 years and eventually just give up, and complete disgrace to them there. So,
I've been told over in Afghanistan you can still find Soviet
carcasses of tanks and things. And
no, like Soviet mines.
oh, that wouldn't surprise me.
Like, there's I forget where in Afghanistan, but there's kind of like a corridor you walk in between, and on either side of you there's grenade and there's mines, but you don't know if they're live or not.
Live or not. I would stay off that corridor. So, but anyway, those places, he very aggressively went after the Soviets. He eventually starts to get some real resistance in Congress for this, which again, you might think, why? Well, the Democrats take over, and they try to get him impeached and all kinds of things, but aggressively went after them. Okay, then the third thing, so we have the economic pressure, we have him challenging them anywhere around the world very aggressively, and then the third thing was a direct military buildup. Right? He wanted to expand our military. So he's undercutting the Soviets' money supply, and then he's expanding our military, which is going to force them to try to expand theirs, but they don't have the money. Right? So it really put them in a pickle of trying to keep up with our escalation of our military, and they were running out of money. So a direct military buildup. So he's building ships, planes, everything. An important part of this is what was officially called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It's, at that point, was mocked by the term Star Wars. The Star Wars, the original Star Wars were coming out, and there's science fiction craziness, and they were saying, Reagan's got this Star Wars idea. It was meant to mock it. But the Strategic Defense Initiative, what it was basically, was a plan to begin developing the science and the technology and the machinery to be able to shoot missiles down. So if the Soviets launched their nuclear missiles, we wouldn't have to just sit here and sing Kumbaya and hold hands till they landed. We could begin knocking them out of the air. All right, and in our documentary, it'll talk about that, and it shows these, cartoon images of these satellites shooting missiles down, and I forget the guy. Some astronomer talking about these. The sounds that were made in this video, and just mocking the whole idea. All right, the whole idea. So, and it was decades away from being really being realized as Reagan envisioned it, but he started. And the Soviets were completely petrified about this. Okay, you have to have that evil, wicked mindset to really understand this. So you shouldn't have a problem. The Soviets, they wanted to rule the world. Their thinking was, if we had this missile shield so that we could shoot down all of the American missiles coming at us, they're thinking, well, of course we're going to launch. We'll completely blow up America. We'll shoot down all their missiles as they come across. We win the game. That's the way the Soviets are thinking. And they assume that we're thinking the same thing. So they're petrified of this thing. They know they can't possibly financially do it. It's massively expensive. So this petrified them. There's a famous, when we get to Reagan, we'll talk about, there's a famous meeting at Reykjavik where Gorbachev offers all this stuff to Reagan. I'll give up this and that and this and that, as long as you give up SDI. And Reagan says, forget it, and literally walks away. Just says, no, we're not going to do it. Now, on the backside, remember that Operation Solo I talked to you about? Reagan had information, he knew this was our biggest fear because of people like Morris Childs. So it's kind of good when you're negotiating to know the one thing that the other side's petrified of. So he refused. He wouldn't give in to it. So anyway, direct military buildup, and the end of this thing is that the Soviets just collapsed under their own weight. Financially, the military pressure, the discontent amongst their own people, they completely collapsed. And it was 1991 when the Soviet Union completely ceases to exist. 89 was when some of the satellite countries, these ones behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, they began to break off and become free. And then 91, the Soviet Union itself collapses. Okay, so Reagan wanted to win this thing. By my watch, we got 40 seconds. Any questions? Should I say I'm going to stay here until there's one viable question? Okay. Can you leave? See you after spring break.